Are you looking for ways to simplify and grow your business? Do you struggle with knowing where to focus your energy for the best return? Or are you loving your business success and looking to stay ahead of the pack through innovation and inspiration? If you've answered yes to any of the following, keep listening because today's episode is sure to inspire you. But before we get started today, I wanted to share with you my free Marketing on a Page template. This easy-to-use template will have you understanding exactly where your business is headed and the exact tactics and steps that you need to take in order to achieve your goals and your vision. Download it today from holisticvision.com.au/strategy or head to the show notes for the link. Now for today's episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode. We're going to be having our guest interviewer, who is Mariah MacInnes from The Content Queen. She's going to be taking us through storytelling so that we can understand how we can better use storytelling to build our brand and business.
Hi, Mariah. It's so great to have you here. Thank you for joining us today. I can't wait to hear more about you and help you to help our audience with storytelling to help grow their business. How about we start with introducing yourself a little bit and just getting to know you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to come on and chat with you. So yes, my name is Mariah, founder of Content Queen, which is a content marketing agency, but also a educational business. I started it in 2019 officially after freelance writing and dipping my toes into the business world. And did lots of freelancing and then sort of grew it into more of an educational space as well to help people that maybe aren't ready to outsource their content and want to learn how they can do it themselves online. And in 2020, I went full time from working in corporate, which was terrifying but exciting. And since then, I've sort of been living a bit of this digital nomad lifestyle and traveling little bits and building up my business, expanding it into an agency, bringing in a team, and recently sort of really diving into what I want to talk about more and what I want to be known for, and that's storytelling definitely being one of them, and then this strategy and kind of bringing them together to really create a unique form of marketing for our business and really be able to use that because our stories are unique, right? And what we share is quite unique. And I've discovered that myself with my own journey online and sharing my own stories. And I had a bit of a health battle in 2021 and I just showed up online and shared my experience. And it's crazy the opportunities that come, not just obviously connecting with people that were going through something similar, but also like, you jump on a discovery call with a potential client. They're like, how's your health? I've seen you sharing that on socials and writing about it online in magazines. And I just went, whoa, storytelling is really powerful. So I just kind of started stepping into my knowledge around what I learned myself and what I know about marketing and content. And kind of built this sort of, I guess, educational pieces and podcasting and things like that about the topic. So that's a little bit about me. I'm currently in Gold Coast, but I'm sure if anyone starts following me on social media, they'll be confused at where I am at any given time because my friends and family are always like, where are you living right now? We don't really know where you are. So that definitely happens. But that's a little bit about me and my journey so far.
Fantastic. Thank you. And well, you're doing the real digital nomad thing, aren't you? Which is amazing. In this day and age, it's fantastic that we can do that and continue to build our businesses wherever we are. And I love the fact that, how you were able to see a difference with communication and with people engaging with you when you started to tell your own personal story and how that goes from not just the content that you were sharing, but it drips into everything and every avenue as well. So thank you for sharing that. I think that takes me to the first question, which I really am interested to find out a bit more about. And that was, well, what does storytelling as a marketing strategy look like?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think a lot of times also, sharing our personal story is amazing and awesome, but there's so many elements to storytelling. It's not just jumping on once upon a time I was here and now I'm there. There's so much more to it. And what I really like to build into any piece that I'm creating is, how can I make this more memorable or relatable, or how can I connect with my audience? And usually what I found out is some kind of story, whether it is a personal story, whether it is an analogy, like even adding an analogy into a piece of content. Everyone's like, oh, I didn't even think of it like that. Like the penny drops when we start to create these different types of stories. So what I like to try and do is, anytime I'm planning out my content, or maybe, planning a month out, whether I've got a new offering coming in or whatever I'm doing, is like, what's the story around this? Because everything has a story. Whether it's the story of why you built it, whether it's the story of a client that just like had an amazing transformation from what you were offering, or a customer that bought your product and it's just like changed the game for them. Like, how can you bring this into what you're creating? Whenever you're promoting, how can you bring a story into that? Whenever you're educating, whether it's a personal experience, as I said before, an analogy, even a story that you've been told before. It doesn't have to be your own personal story. It's just like, how can you start to ask yourself the question of, how can I create more engaging content by adding in these stories? We're seeing on TikTok now, TikTok's growing so much, and it's still continuing to grow. These people are so relatable because they're sharing their experiences and their stories. And everyone's like, every time I open the app and I see like, so the other day I was here, I'm like, I'm invested, like I want to know what happened the other day, and we have this power to really captivate our audience through this, but do it also in a little bit more of a strategic way of how we can, and we see now, copywriting and content unfortunately get mixed up, but they're two different things. Your content is your educational pieces, your newsletters, your social media posts, and your copies, your website stuff. But within both of these encompass storytelling. With your copy, it's the imagine if, putting people in their shoes. What if this happened? What if, and sort of telling a story around the person that's reading your piece of copy and how you can help them. So it is about, every time you're looking at your content marketing side of your marketing strategy, how can I add a story? But then also in your other forms of marketing, right? So if you're doing Facebook ads, how can you tell a story in your Facebook ads? If you're doing your website, even like if you're networking as part of your marketing strategy, because I think networking is a really big part of my marketing strategy and getting myself out there. How can I share more stories when can I make myself more relatable? Do I have my like signature story, which is sort of your origin story, why you got started? And one you asked me at the very beginning of this podcast interview is, tell us about you and your story. And all the time, if we're out and about, tell me about yourself. And if you have those like stories that make you can have different stories at any given moment, it just makes you relatable and people remember you. This is a really interesting story of how I actually hired my first business coach. Great marketing, but she didn't realize this was marketing at the time. So I was at a bar in Melbourne. It was AFL Grand Final, and of course it's huge in Melbourne. And I'm at a bar and I was with all these friends, and a mutual friend, I was talking to him and he's like, what do you want to do? And at this time I had a blog and a podcast just for fun, travels, my antics in life. I was like early to mid 20s, just like talking about just nothing on social media and loving it. And he said, what do you want to do? I was like, I want to monetize my podcast. I'd love to be like, I think I just wanted to be a content creator, to be honest. And he said, you should check out this woman. Her name is Ruby Lee. She is a business coach, and she made $65,000 in 65 days. And that became a story that someone told me about her. And she created that narrative without even, maybe she did, but she didn't know that person was going to tell that story to me. And that was a story. And I started following her on LinkedIn straight away, listened to every single one of her podcasts. And 12 months later, I hired her as my business coach. So you can see how a simple story in a bar of an entrepreneur became the reason why I bought from someone. So you can see that power right there. And it doesn't mean you have to be the the monetary, you don't have to put a monetary value. You don't have to be the 65,000 in 65 days, but how can you become known through your stories? You know, are you the person that did X, Y, Z, and that's people know you? And then you become a story that, because we all love telling stories, you know, you've got your story toppers, like if you're at a party or at a barbecue and someone tells a story and then someone's got another story and then that person's got another story.
Yes.
You want to be the person that you want to become part of someone's story. So, you know, I know this person that did this and did that. And then they go, oh, that's interesting. And then you start doing the research on social media. And if you're still sharing your stories online, you're really going to captivate your audience. So that's a very long answer to your question, but you can kind of see how it becomes a bit more strategic than just showing up online. Of course, there's times where we just share stories because we want to share them, but there can be definite moments where we put a bit more strategy and a bit more thought around it and kind of craft something that it's never a mistake. It's never a mistake that someone shares your story online with someone else or at a party, because you've shown up, you've shared your stories, you've shared similar stories, and you've kind of captivated your audience enough that they're like, that is an interesting story that I want to tell to people, you know, down the street, at the coffee shop, at a party. So yeah, that's sort of a long answer to your question.
No, thank you. I don't mind long answers because, I mean, your answer gave a lot of information and it shared a lot in terms of giving that example of how one story can lead into, you know, you eventually hiring this business coach from hearing something in a bar. So something that's so small and possibly insignificant at that moment can lead into a much bigger thing for you, for your business, and for the person on the other side as well. So it makes sense that we do take some time out to look at the strategy and identify what our story is. When we're talking about stories, you know, you mentioned this one of this lady, this coach, where your friend said that she made X amount in 65 days. What type of stories should we be sharing in our content? I know you touched on a few things before. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah. So of course, like we know, given we've got our own stories. I mentioned like your origin story. It can be tailored depending on what you're doing and where you're sharing your story. For example, like if I was to come on a podcast where someone wants to talk about my freelancer journey, then of course my origin story around starting on Fiverr would come out. If someone wants to talk to me about health and being an entrepreneur and my health journey, then I would jump on and that would become my origin story. So we have our stories. Our stories can be anything from, as I said, that sort of origin story, why you got started, to just something that happened to you in your business, something that happened yesterday. I've told stories before of like I went to drive back home. I was living in a country town in Victoria and I had to drive over a snowy mountain, and we didn't have chains on our car because we didn't know it was going to be snowing up there because it was May.
Oh no.
So we get to the top and there is no chance that we have to go back and go the long way through Melbourne. And it took us 7 hours to get home. But it was a really nice lesson that you don't always have to go the shorter way because it's going to be quicker. And often the long road is safer, less risky, and it gets you to your destination. And it was a nice story that I could tell using the horrific moment, like traumatizing moment that my partner and I went through. But, you know, these stories, it doesn't just have to be this big, like, this life-changing moment that changed my life forever. And because maybe that hasn't happened to some people yet. Like maybe it just, and we all have those aha moments of why we started our business. And whether it doesn't have to, as I said, be something so traumatic or so amazing, that it could be very straightforward of this is what happened and this is why I made that decision. And then you have these other stories that happen to you on your day-to-day that you can start bringing into your content to make it fun. And that's where those analogies start to come in. So another one is definitely analogies. And we are 22 times more likely to remember something if it's told as a story. So that is why I do try to add storytelling into a lot of my content so people will remember it. We're getting thrown, you know, Instagram, Reels, TikToks, emails. all the time. And how do we
Exactly.
remember these things? And one of them is sharing those stories. So analogies are a great thing to do if you if you're not confident in your own story, or you're just not sure. And one of the things I did is when I started my TikTok, I really wanted to balance this storytelling and strategy, which is something I really like, as I said before, to kind of bring together. And so what I would do is I would share a strategy, and then I would share stories to try and help people remember it. And I really wanted to teach my content marketing strategy in sort of bite-sized chunks. And I used it as a baking analogy. So I referred every part of the strategy to the steps of baking a cake. So you had your dry ingredients, your wet ingredients, your flavorings, and at the end you have a cake. And not everyone's cake is the same, even if you follow the same recipe. It always ends up different. And I used this analogy, and I then repurposed it onto Instagram. And it was really interesting with the feedback that people was like, oh my God, that is so cool. And, I'm trying to really, step into, I do like an analogy, and sometimes they don't always come as naturally as I would like, but just trying to think of, okay, I've got this educational piece, or I've got this really interesting thought leadership that I want to share on my LinkedIn, or I've got 5 tips to XYZ that I want to share. Like, how can I make it a bit more interesting? So analogies could be one. Then you have your client stories, which become your testimonials, but a different way of sharing a testimonial, rather than Mariah was fantastic, she did this, she did that. How can you encourage, whenever you're asking for a testimonial from your potential, or your past clients or your current clients, how can you bring a before and after? So what was it like working with me before? What was it like not working with me before you started working with me? And what does it look like now that you've worked with me? And you can actually craft a really beautiful testimonial from what they've said in those 2 instances. Okay, I was overwhelmed. I didn't know what I was doing. I was posting on social media and nothing was happening. And since hiring Mariah and her agency, we've been more consistent, showed up more than ever. We got more website traffic, and you can start to build like a really nice story about your client and the journey. And that's a really nice way, because someone that's looking to hire you could look at that story and be like, that's me right now, and that's where I can be. So that's a really nice story. And then another one, of course, is stories in the public domain, whether it's the story of, and especially if you're creating a business and you're really passionate, and your business might be you might create eco products, and you're really passionate about sustainability, and you create some educational pieces around that for your product-based business to kind of be seen as a thought leader. How can you bring in stories from the public space into your content to sort of show people, is it that, we're seeing X amount of waste in our oceans, and you can start to talk and build that narrative around, the public stories, things that have happened over the years that are awful in the news, but you utilize them to really be seen as a thought leader, and even just stories that happen around that pique interest. If you are a Harry Potter fan and you want to spice up and make your content a bit different, can you add like some stories from, this is more of a fictional story, but like, can you add things that we publicly know about to help people understand what you're trying to teach, what you're trying to sell, everything? And public domain stories we know them all. One it's not so much public domain, but one I do really like is, if I have, it's kind of becomes my story, but it's also someone else's story. If I go out for lunch with someone and they tell me something really fascinating, how can I still bring that in to my everyday content and sort of still accredit that person because they've told me and they've shared that story with me? So there's sort of the 4, I guess, story types. Your stories, you've got analogies / hypothetical. Hypothetical can also be, what if you were XYZ? And that's where your copy more so comes in, your copywriting. Then we have the client stories, the transformations, everything like that. And then we have our public domain stories. So that's sort of the 4 stories you can play around with and sort of use within your content. And I will share sort of how, I guess, and I know this would be a question coming up, is how I actually go, okay, this needs a story, because we're creating.
Exactly.
How, you're just creating, getting things out there, creating for your socials or whatever you're doing. It's not always at top of mind for us. So it's a habit as well.
Yeah. And I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons, is that you have to start getting into that mind frame, correct, of putting yourself there and thinking about those stories. I know for me, one thing that I do is, because I don't think that I'm the greatest at storytelling, but I understand the importance and relevance of it for business and marketing. So I find that I write down, if I've got a story in my head, I just write it down and I've got it there to refer to when I need it, and I can put something more to it in the future as well. So, I definitely think that that's a great idea. And I love that there's 4 ways that we can be telling those stories. So that's helpful, because I think within those 4, there'll definitely be ones that will resonate with some people more than others too. So you've got the option of exploring each of those and seeing where they would fit into your strategy as well, which is important. Talking about strategy, what strategies have helped you bring storytelling to life in your content?
Yeah, so this is one, there's multiple, but this one really helps for me sort of every time I am, for example, it depends on everyone and what they create. If you, for example, you have this podcast here, and I know you mentioned before, like you transcribe. So obviously there's, there's other content you can do from there. And every time I have like my podcast, that is sort of my main piece of content. I always think about, how can I bring a story into this in some way? And it might not be, obviously, when I have the guest on, they share their story. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
But if I'm ever doing solo episodes, I always think like, how can I bring in a story? With blogging, it depends on the types of blogs I'm writing, because a lot of the blogs are more, we want to do them for SEO. So they're a bit more keyword based. And if it makes sense, I always add a personal experience. But even on social media, if I've got my strategy lined out, I know on a Monday, I might promote, on a Tuesday I might educate, on a Wednesday, and that's why it's important to have a content marketing strategy, what's happening on each day. It's not random, it's all got a purpose. And then you can start asking yourself, every time you're mapping out the content, planning it, you go, okay, we've got this piece of content. Is there a story that can be implemented into this? So what I try and do is, if I've got a story, I try and add a lesson to it. And if I've got a lesson, I try to add a story to it. So this will really, and I learned this from an amazing storyteller. She does like public speaking storytelling, and she really helped me with this. I did some work with her, and I created content for her, but she was so good at teaching, and she's taught me so much that I'm sharing with everyone today. And I was like, that is perfect for me to understand, okay, if I'm doing the 5 tips to XYZ, how can I add a story to make this more memorable? Is it just an analogy? Is it my own personal experience with this? Like, it doesn't always, it can be different at any given moment. And just really trying to, and as you said before, with the storytelling thing, it is this habit. And I love that you write these stories down and you have a bank of them, because having something where you can always refer to and have content ideas stored is so helpful for these moments. But I always, I said to recently, it's almost like you need a sticky note, like on your window or whenever you're creating, it's like add a story. So when you look at it, because I've been guilty of this too, you get into the habit of churning out content, and then you're like, none of that had stories in it. None of that had like this next level of depth that I want to bring into it. So I have that in the back of my mind. If I've got a story, I'm like, okay, well, I need to have purpose around it. So what's the purpose? Okay, it's going to help my audience see that this part of content marketing is important, or this part of business is interesting. Sometimes it can just be to provide motivation for people, depending on, of course, your values in your business and the types of content that you share. There, and it's interesting, whenever I have a client that I do various different things with clients, and one of them is like more mentoring, and she'll send me the content. She's like, I'm like, okay, cool. What's the purpose? What do you want to achieve for this? And it's okay to sometimes have purpose of just motivation or just inspiration. Like, that's why, if you look at sort of people with their content pillars, some of them do have just to create inspiration, to be seen as someone that is inspiring for others. It doesn't always have to be to generate sales, which of course is what we want when we start a business and we create content, but everything sort of makes up the ecosystem of what we're sort of trying to create. So definitely things like that reminder, that consistent reminder of, okay, if I've got a lesson, how can I add a story to it? And if I've got a story, what's the purpose of this story? What am I trying to achieve with this? And how does this fit into what I'm trying to teach in this month, or what I'm trying to sell in this month, what I'm trying to achieve, maybe not just month, quarter, year of my business. And that's why it's important to know your goals and sort of have a bit of a strategy around your content, because then these stories make sense to it. Everything,
exactly.
It was funny. I was talking today, and a client sort of asked me, do I have to create that fluff kind of content, like, world, international this day, international that day, and I said, you don't. But if you do, everything has a purpose. So why are you creating international that day? Because they can work really well for your business. I said, one of them I did on my personal brand, because I have Content Queen and I have a personal brand. And the reason I did this is my health journey. As I said, I was sharing those stories, and it had become a bit separate from Content Queen. So I made that conscious decision, and I have a team, so I'm confidently can post on both. But if I was doing it on my own, I could not. So I started, just kind of had my own personal brand, and International Tea Day came up. And International Tea Day, I was like, I love tea, and it has brought me so much comfort over the years, right? And I knew that I could relate to, and it's also to be relatable to people in your space and people that, and I wrote this, like, just for one International Tea Day, I created a reel, and I just wrote this really, like, in-depth caption on it. And it wasn't for everyone, but the people that responded really appreciated it. And it was people that are people within my memberships and courses. So it served its purpose. It was just a fun post, but it showed my interests and a little bit more about me. And we know that people buy your energy.
Exactly.
And we know personal branding is so important. So even those, like, those simple content ideas and those simple content days of international this day, or a world pasta day, or if it has true meaning and you can share that experience and it makes sense and it has, a purpose, even if the purpose is small, then that's how you can kind of create a strategy around these pieces of content, these types of stories, and it all starts to make sense. And we know, one piece of content across a whole year, or one piece a week across a whole year, across 5 years, makes such a difference in the whole grand scheme of consistency and being seen. Exactly. And so definitely, having a place where you can store your stories as well. I absolutely love that. I think that's such a good idea. And because, we might be out on a walk and, this is a really cool story. And then by the time we get back from the walk, we've completely forgotten, or it gets pushed aside, and then we're going to create content and we're like, I don't know what I'm going to post, because all those good ideas never got captured.
All gone. Exactly.
Voice noting is a really useful one as well. I used to voice note myself a lot, because I would email myself and then I would be like, I don't know what Mariah in 2 weeks ago meant. I have no idea what she was talking about. So I voice note yourself, because your quick writing sentences are not cutting it. They're not making sense. So definitely having a place to store those, and a consistent reminder of that. Where can I add these stories in to serve its purpose across my goals and what I want to achieve with my online platforms and my content?
Yeah. And, I do love having sticky notes. I always have sticky notes everywhere. And that's a great tip to remind yourself, pop a sticky note up there, and you've got the constant reminder when you're writing content. So thank you for that little tip. And I also wanted to ask you, lastly, before we go, was, we've got everybody listening, and they're obviously getting a lot of ideas of how they can start to use stories in their business, in their branding, and in their strategy. What would be the next step for people who do want to use more storytelling in their marketing?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because you can listen to a podcast and be like, cool, that was great, and then never do anything with it.
Yeah.
And I really want to make sure that everyone is not just inspired, but takes action. I am very big on action and execution. That is something I'm very big on. So a few things that you want to do and how you definitely want to get started is get that origin story down. And if you haven't got it, if you've got it down, amazing. It's time to start using it. And if you haven't, it is time to just start thinking about, okay, why did I start my business? I mean, if you were to join a podcast and people say, tell us about you, how did you get to where you are today? What would you say? So start writing that down. Once you've got that down, it's really nice to put it into your space. I'm hoping it's on your website. I'm sure it's already in some maybe you just start a blog of your origin story, so you've got it in an online channel if anyone's interested to hear about you. Doesn't mean it's a blog that's going to rank for SEO or anything like that. And you can start to build it into some social posts, just so you've put it out there, you've created your first story. And then, of course, you want to start thinking about, okay, with my daily or weekly plan of what I create on social media, every time, okay, do I create a weekly blog? And it definitely depends on what content people create. But then it's time to start thinking about, okay, within a given week, within a given month, where can I start filling in stories into these pieces? I know every Tuesday I create an educational piece around the latest blog that I've done. Can I actually turn it on its head a little bit? Instead of just sharing the 5 tips, can I share my personal experience, and then within a nice flick through carousel on Instagram or in the stories, can it be, people can swipe through and get the most, educational piece? So it's now just going back and looking at your current strategy. Again, if you don't have one, I wouldn't be like, oh, I don't have a content marketing strategy, I'm done for. It's totally fine. No. There's so much content out there to help you start a strategy. It can be very basic. It's just like, okay, what are my goals? Who am I serving on what channels? How many days do I want to show up? And every Tuesday it's a this post, every Wednesday it's this post. Just do that for now and just have that laid out, and you will improve and iterate, because we know marketing is a consistent iteration process. It is never done. The work is never done, which is great for us, because we keep getting work. But for everyone else in the business industry is like, oh my God, I just want to land. And social media is evolving all the time. So unfortunately, we kind of have to stay on top of it to some degree. So if you just lay out, okay, and this is what I'm offering for this month, or this is my main product that I'm selling, so this is the content I'm going to create. And as you're starting to, if you batch, awesome. If you don't, also fine. Just start creating, okay, these are the posts I'm going to do. And then ask yourself this question: what story, what tiny little, and I have this really beautiful mentor, and she calls them little heartbeats. How can you add like this little heartbeat into this piece of content to make it a little bit different? So if you're planning on talking about World Animal Day or International this day or Halloween, depending on your business, how can you add a little heartbeat, a little piece of information that's going to make this engaging and relatable? And it doesn't always have to be a story about you, as we've mentioned, because sometimes we can feel like, oh, I just feel like I'm talking about myself all the time. But how can you create something that gives it just that little heartbeat? And I really like that she taught me that, this little heartbeat. It's such a really beautiful way of talking about it. And it definitely helps your content stand out, because there's going to be heaps of people talking about what we talk about, heaps of people doing World Animal Day and International this day and all the other things that we create content on. But it's these stories that will help you stand out. So it's like, how can I just start adding tiny stories? And of course, it's a habit, as I mentioned before.
Yes.
So you're not going to think of stories from the very beginning. You're not going to have all of this bank of stories from the get-go, but you start to see that life is content. As my Scottish housemate in 2020, just before we went into lockdown, we went to the beautiful Wilson's Prom in Victoria, and we're walking across, and she goes, I said, oh, this is just so beautiful. And we're taking photos. She goes, life is content. I was like, oh, you're so right. So, life is content. There's things happening around us all the time. It doesn't mean we have to be always on and always sharing. It's just being observant to things that we want to share. It could be, you could have heard a podcast and they taught a really interesting lesson on that podcast. Becomes a story. I was walking down the beach, listening to this podcast. This is what was happening at that time. And this is the story I heard. I mean, a lot of these stories I've just told have been, just tiny little things that have happened, but it's just like creating that sort of picture around that story and adding those little heartbeats into your content. So you might have me in your head now, if everyone's creating content, it's like story, tell a story, but start off with your story. Add it into your content as like sort of that foundational pieces that you create, and then build from there. And don't be too hard on yourself, because it takes time.
Yes, time and perseverance, like we said as well, consistency. And I do love the analogy of the heartbeats. That's, that truly resonates with me. It makes sense. adding a heartbeat to your piece of content. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing, the 4 different types of storytelling that we can start using as well. I think that that's really useful information that we can start taking on board immediately. And like you said, you love action taking, and so do I. And I think that today's episode, there's so much there that people will be able to say, hey, yep, I'm going to start doing those voice recordings when I've got that story in my head on my walk, and use that in a piece of content that educates and add that little heartbeat to it. So thank you, Mariah. Thank you for everything that you've shared and being so open and honest with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I've loved chatting with you, all things storytelling, and I hope it was really valuable to your listeners.
I'm sure that it is. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. Like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you find value from today's episode. And remember, if you've got friends and colleagues looking for inspiration as they grow their business, share this podcast with them. Follow me on Instagram at Holistic Vision Consultancy, or check out my website holisticvision.com.au. Until next week, to your success, my friend.